One of the cars that defined the 1970s is the iconic 1971 to 1973 Buick Boattail Riviera. This was the third generation of the Riviera as a personal luxury coupe. The car originally started out as a personal luxury coupe in 1963. That first generation ran from 1963 through 1965. The second generation, which I think is actually the most beautiful looking Riviera, ran from 1966 through 1970. And then for 1971, General Motors design team decided to take the car in a totally different direction. And hence you have the Boattail. Today what we're going to talk about are the top 5 facts that you might not know about the Boattail Riviera. And let's see if this is fun or not. Some of these things are minutia, some of these things are larger, but let's get started. And we'll begin with number 5. At number 5, we have that the Boattail Riviera used some interesting interior components, some shared, some different, between other General Motors vehicles. Now, interestingly, like I said, the Boattail Riviera ran from 1971 through 1973. It was a very brief run. And on the interior, at least for the 1971 and 1972 model years, was relatively sporty. You got these high back seats, and often you saw the Rivieras that had the bucket seats with the center console with the unique shifter shape. And one of the things I wanted to point out was that the dash in the Riviera, only for 1971 and 1972, was unique to Riviera. It was not shared with the other full-size Buicks. You can see in this picture that the 1971 and 72 Riviera have this kind of twin cockpit theme where the dash is formed around the driver and then formed around the passenger. Of course, the passenger just has a crash pad and there's no gauges there. But this was only employed in the 71 and 72 model years. If you look now at a 1973 Riviera dash, you'll notice that there is no twin cockpit theme anymore. It has the same wraparound kind of area in front of the driver, but the crash pad in front of the passenger is just flat. And that's because, for whatever reason, Buick decided for 1973 that as opposed to employing the unique dash, they would just share the same as the Electra and the LeSabre as an example. So why Buick decided up front to have a different shape dash and did that for 2 model years and then reverted to the standard full-size Buick dash, I don't know. But my guess is they were probably trying to cut costs. And a unique dash pad was something that was additional complexity. And it's really not something that many people notice until you point it out. But that's one way, if you're just looking at interiors, to tell if you're looking at a 71, 2, or 3 Riviera. Now, another interesting component was that the interiors of the 71 to 73 Riviera also used some components from other GM divisions, and something that no other car, at least to my knowledge, employed. And that was, if you take a look at the headrests here in the 71 Riviera, they are the same as the headrests in Cadillacs. In fact, the seat back also has that same high shape to it. And that was a unique Cadillac feature, really for safety reasons. Cadillac gave you a higher back seat than the other General Motors divisions. And they also had a unique headrest that was not employed on others. Take a look here as an example at the 1971 Electra with its headrests, and you can see that they are distinctly different. Now, what I will also tell you is that the Cadillac headrests, interestingly, feel cheaper. They're kind of made out of this harder plastic material, and they do have some cushion to them, but they're pretty firm. I mean, if your head hits the back of that and you're rear-ended, I think it's going to hurt a little bit. It's not the nicer foam-padded, softer headrests that were employed on many other General Motors vehicles. So there's a couple little tidbits of trivia for you on the 1971 to 1973 Riviera interior. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the 1971 only vent louvers in the deck lid that were a result of GM's new flow-through ventilation system, or at least a new style of flow-through ventilation system. Now, the Riviera from the previous generation, as an example, did not have vent windows, nor did its sibling Tornado or Eldorado, and vent windows were kind of going out of style at this point. But by 1971, General Motors across its entire full-size lineup eliminated vent windows. And in their place, or just in trying to get better flow-through ventilation, all General Motors vehicles had louvers in the deck lids on them, at least all the full-size General Motors cars, and even cars like the Vega had these louvers. Now, this was only used in General Motors on the full-size cars for 1971 because they found a number of issues associated with them. Number one was that in some cases, if the car were just parked and idling, it was found that exhaust fumes could backdraft into the cabin. And that was pretty hard to do, I think. And General Motors had the fan speed always on low or higher on these cars. Even if you put the climate control in the off position, the fan was still running on low speed. But they did have some complaints about that. And the other issue was that the water would run through the middle of the deck lid. And then if it were wintertime, as an example, and you went to a car wash, it would freeze and then the deck lid wouldn't want to open because the water was trying to get out, but it couldn't before it froze. And then you had a heck of a time trying to open your trunk. And yes, by the way, people in the Midwest do go to car washes. They're enclosed and heated when it's wintertime and below freezing because your car looks like crap since there's salt all over it. So that was a relatively common occurrence. And of course, leaves and debris and pine needles would get in there as well and clog everything up and then rot the deck lid out. It just was not a good design. And so General Motors got rid of it after a year. And the other interesting thing about it was that the number of louvers decreased over time as well throughout the 1971 model year. They had more louvers to start and then a little bit fewer louvers later. It just was not a good setup. And then the flow-through ventilation system exhaust would move into the lock pillar, a much better place for it. So that was an interesting little tidbit of trivia for the 1971 Riviera and the 1971 variant alone. Again, that was similar to other General Motors cars, but the 71 Riviera is the only Boattail that has those louvers in the deck lid. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have some interesting design trivia about the Boattail Riviera. Now, the Boattail Riviera was really pushed by General Motors Vice President Bill Mitchell. And Bill Mitchell always loved that boat-tail shape, kind of reminiscent of the true classic cars like the Auburn Boattail Speedster. And perhaps it was appropriate on the Boattail Riviera because it was on a Buick. And Auburns were kind of the Buick of the era. They weren't the super expensive cars like the Duesenbergs. They were meant to be relatively affordable. Well, I'll say relatively affordable. And like I said, kind of the Buick of the era. And so putting that kind of wingback shape on the Riviera perhaps was appropriate. But Bill Mitchell loved that shape and that form, and he employed it on other cars as well, including the 1963 Stingray Corvette, which you notice has a very similar upper that kind of comes to a tapered point. Of course, the point doesn't protrude out like it does on the 1971 Riviera, where Bill Mitchell made it even more pronounced. But Mitchell was such a fan of that particular shape that he kind of employed it on a number of different vehicles, and the Riviera was another one. Unfortunately, the third generation Riviera personal luxury coupe was not a sales success like the 1963 Stingray was. And so it didn't work here. And we're going to talk about a little bit why, perhaps that was. But that was his signature. That kind of upper form was really Bill Mitchell's signature with that big back glass as well. Now, another piece of interesting design trivia is that the chief designer for the Boattail Riviera was somebody named Jerry Hirschberg. And Jerry Hirschberg at this point was a General Motors designer, was chief of the Buick Exterior Studio. But Jerry Hirschberg would later go on to become the design chief for all of Nissan North America. He's since deceased, but a number of Rivieras would be designed under his watch and a number of Buicks as well. In fact, Hirschberg left General Motors relatively early in his career, in 1980, I believe, to become the head of Nissan Design International in California. And while he was somewhat criticized for the designs that came out under his tenure at Nissan, he certainly designed some iconic cars and other things over the course of his career. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have that its successor, the 1974 to 76 Riviera, was actually based on a Cadillac proposal. Now, by the time the 1971 Riviera was launched and into 1972, it was clear that the car was not a sales success. And Buick division management was up in arms that GM Design had really shoved this Boattail Riviera down their throats. They didn't necessarily want it to begin with, and they certainly didn't like it after it didn't sell. But as the vehicles were being designed for the 1974 model year, GM Design Chief Bill Mitchell relented and basically gave the Buick general managers what they wanted, which was a different Riviera that was more conventional, hence the 1974 Riviera, kind of the forgotten Riviera, if not the 1977 to 78 Riviera was even more forgotten. But the 1974 Riviera was designed by Wayne Cady under the mandate that he de-boat-tail the car. That was the mandate. And actually, Bill Mitchell told him that he was supposed to de-boat-tail it and replace it with a successor vehicle that was based on this Cadillac model. Now, you notice that this Cadillac model has a very similar rear shape and, interestingly, doesn't have vertical fins and vertical tail lamps. It was something that was a little bit different for Cadillac, and perhaps that's why Bill Mitchell thought it might be more appropriate for a Buick as opposed to a Cadillac. Would have made, I think, a handsome Cadillac proposal. In fact, the front end is rather good looking, I would say. But alas, it would not become a Cadillac, and as I mentioned, Wayne Cady would be told by Bill Mitchell verbatim to take that rear end and put it on the Riviera. Now, that may not be as easy as it seems, because what does that entail? Remember that Wayne did not have money for new doors, a new roof panel, etc. So you have to blend the rear of that proposal in with the existing door from the Boattail Riviera and make it all look harmonious and effectively a cohesive design. That certainly must not have been an easy task, but given the task and given what he was required to do, I don't think the 74 Riviera turned out all that bad necessarily. Certainly better than the Successor 77 to 78 Riviera. But that 77 to 78 Riviera was also born out of the division general managers and the sales managers wanting a conventional Riviera. They were so loath to have anything that was controversial that they rotated in the complete opposite direction and basically got kind of a warmed over LeSabre looking Riviera. That 77 to 78 Riviera, I think, is really terrible. It's not a bad design. It's just completely uninteresting and uninspired. I mean, you think about the first generation Riviera, the second generation Riviera, they were beautiful cars, beautiful personal luxury coupes. The 77 to 78 is just way too conventional. 74 to 76 is rather conventional as well, but not as conventional as the generation that came after it. Let's move on now to number one, the final in this list. And that is that the Boattail Riviera was originally designed to be a smaller car, an intermediate-sized car. It was never designed from the start to be a full-size vehicle. Now, obviously, the 71 Boattail became a full-size car, and this, I suspect, was true of the Tornado and the Eldorado as well. Remember, they had their own E-body platform, which was not a full-size platform. I should say the car was kind of full-size, but it was a unique platform for the 1966 to 70 model years for the Tornado and Riviera, and 1967 to 70 for the Eldorado. But for 1971, all of them went on a bigger platform that was based on the full-size General Motors B-bodies. And they all grew bigger than designers had wanted, but I think the Riviera suffered the most in this transition. Now, what does this mean? The Riviera had to share the A-pillars and the windshield and the front glass of the General Motors B-bodies. And that really dictated a number of things, that the car was going to be extremely wide at the A-pillars because those A-pillars touched down far and out. And as a result, it just lost so much when you look at here the original proposals. Take a look at this particular photo and how sculptural it is when the Riviera was in advanced design. And you could see that there's just so much more room for the lines and the surfaces to move around the car and move around that A-pillar area when it was on the intermediate platform. And it just looks so much better and dramatic. Here's another view of the A-body Riviera from the side view. And again, you can see that the car just has a lot more gesture and uniqueness associated with it. And, it lost so much when it went from that to this. Now, if you look at the front end of this 71 Riviera as an example, you can tell that the lines and the surfaces from the front just really want to wrap around the side and have more surface area there between the A-pillar and the outer edge of the car, but they can't because the car was already 80 inches wide. And if you made it wider, then you'd have to have an oversized load, let's say sticker on it or a banner. And of course, nobody's going to want to drive a car with that. So, well, designers had to do the best that they could, sharing those particular components. And I think while the 71 Riviera in particular was still dramatic, it did get toned down in subsequent years. It just wasn't the dramatic car that the original vision had. And that was likely because the bean counter said, you can't have a totally unique platform anymore. Realistically, the Tornado, the Eldorado, and the second-gen Riviera weren't a huge sales success from a combined volume standpoint. The Riviera itself was a sales success, but it was the only one of that generation that was. The Tornado, not so much. The Eldorado, not so much. In fact, the Tornado and the Eldorado, the generation after that 66 to 70 or 67 to 70 in the case of the Eldorado, far outsold the previous generation. The Riviera was the only one that the sales volumes went down with the Boattail, and I think that's because the design suffered. I have to say, I think that if they had been able to make the Riviera on the A-body platform, the intermediate platform, which was what it was originally proposed and designed to do, I think it would have been a huge sales success, at least if it had come out anything looking like this design. But when you had to force it on that platform that was sharing a lot with the B-body, particularly those A-pillars and the touchdown points and the cowl and the windshield touchdown and the windshield itself, well, you were kind of doomed, I think. And the designers really did the best that they could from that point forward. So what do you think about this list? Anything else about the Boattail Riviera that you love that's unique? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.